Okay, I'm just going to give it one more minute and then we're going to kick off for today. I wanted to thank everybody for joining us on this webinar. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Sally Pilot. I am the Chief Insight and Engagement Director at Black Sun. Really happy to be here. I hope everybody's keeping safe and well in this environment. And, you know, I'm really excited about this series of webinars we've been doing. We were just talking before we got on the call, and Peter was saying, I think in the last few weeks, he's done more webinars than he has done in his entire life, which I think is probably true for all of us. So I can't say that we're experts at this yet, so bear with us if the technology doesn't work, but I will just talk you through how it does work today. We have a webinar planned for you today with 3 excellent external speakers. You can participate in the webinar. We're hoping that we can answer as many questions as possible. There is a Q&A facility on the webinar in the bottom bar where you can type in your questions. When you type in your questions, all of the panelists will be able to see. If there's somebody particularly you want to direct it to, if you could just put their name, that would be super. If not, I will take the question and direct it to the group as well. We have a number of questions to do throughout the session as well. I've also got some polling. So in a few minutes, I will launch the poll and we'll do all the polling questions at the very beginning. So hopefully it will be quite easy for everybody to do, and I'll be able to see how many of you are able to do that. So hopefully it's quite straightforward and everybody's excellent at this now. So without further ado, I just thought I would introduce the next external webinar in our series. And this is really about how to plan for your AGM this year. And I think with all the change and uncertainty around this, from talking to our clients, we thought it would be a really good idea to bring some of the experts together to share with us some of the guidance that's been published, and also to hear from somebody who's actually already done a virtual webinar and hear from her experience. So we're really happy about that. So who I've got with me today to share their experience is I've got Peter Swabey, who's the Policy and Research Director from the Chartered Governance Institute, and I think a well-known figure in the governance space who probably needs no introduction. I've got Robert Innes, who's kindly agreed to join us today from Slaughter and May. He's a corporate partner, and actually really interestingly, I've only met him virtually, so it's a really new environment where we'll be just meeting people for the first time on video. So I'm really looking forward to meeting him in person. But he's kindly going to share with us some of his technical expertise. In Slaughter and May, we're very involved in writing the guidance, and he's been working with corporates and his colleagues on this. And then, of course, we've got Susan Swabey, who is Company Secretary for Smith Nephew. She's been there for 10 years now, I think, or just over 10 years. I've actually known Susan for years, and I think, as I am, she's a bit of a reporting and governance geek, I like to think, so we cross paths quite a lot. And what I love about Susan is she gets very involved, and she's very passionate about what she does, and she's very happy to share her experiences. So I'm really delighted that she's here to share her experiences with everybody today. And that's what really we're trying to do here at Black Sun, is really bring people together, share experiences, and in this environment, learn from each other and have better collaboration. So what I'm going to do is, we've gone through that. We will be sending around the presentation afterwards. All of the speakers have agreed to send it around, so you don't need to take notes. So we will send it around, and the webinar will also be recorded for everyone, okay? So if you miss anything, you can certainly refer to it again. For those of you that don't know Black Sun, we're an international stakeholder communications company, and we're really about working with companies to help define, articulate, and communicate their value creation story to all of their different stakeholders and across many different channels. I think often we're probably pigeonholed in the reporting, and I think our origins are very much in reporting. But what we found through our times is we're working with more and more corporates on their holistic story and communicating that more broadly to their different stakeholders. So really trying to help them create an authentic story and communicate it to their various different stakeholders in a consistent and coherent way. And just so you know, hopefully you've been tuning into a few of our webinars, but we have been following this very closely, trying to understand what best practice means, what some of the challenges are, and how companies are addressing them through their communications and their reporting. We've got a little bit of a hub on our site, and we've been doing regular updates to the market. So please stay tuned if you haven't seen that already. Hopefully you will have seen some of our research in the past. We're on our 15th edition of our Trends in Corporate Reporting of the FTSE 100. We've already got some interesting findings, and we'll be sharing that over the coming week. So please look out for that, as well as a lot of other research that we've been doing around some of the topical elements such as TCFD and digital communication, social media, and other things like that as we all move into this digital arena. So without further ado, as I said, I'm going to pass over to Peter and Robert. And the way that it's going to work is, first of all, I would like to launch a poll. So I'm going to launch the poll right now. So to get us started, if everybody can find the poll and answer those questions, there's 6 pretty simple questions. And I thought this would really begin to set the context for the day and help Peter, Robert, and Susan in terms of the way that they direct their questions. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to answer that poll. Can everybody see the poll? Because I don't see anybody who's voting yet. Now there? Okay, so it's starting. The polling should be along the bottom of your screen if you haven't been able to find it yet. And from the attendance list or the registration, we know, I think we have 99% company secretaries, which is exciting. I feel slightly intimidated by so many company secretaries on one call. But what we wanted to do is really see what stage you were at. So it looks like we have a number of December year ends, a couple of Marches, not so many June and Septembers. I guess they're waiting to see if some of this lists. So I will, as I said, just give you a couple more minutes. It would be great. I know there are 100 or so of you on the call, so I will give it a couple more minutes to see how many people will vote, to give some context. And then on another note, can anybody believe it's May? And we've been in lockdown for 7 weeks. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's gone by really quickly. I don't know how you guys feel, but one day just merges into the next. And it was really funny when we were talking about this webinar and organizing it. We were looking at diaries, and miraculously, both Peter and Susan had Friday completely free, no meetings in. And then we said, oh, we'll go for Friday. That sounds like a good day. And then one of my team came back and said, it's actually it's a holiday on Friday. So that's why we didn't quite appreciate that at the time. So thank goodness we're not doing it on a Friday. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Peter. Peter, if you want to take it away. I'm not sure if we can run the poll in the background because we've got just about over half of you, but maybe we don't know if we can talk and go at the same time. Okay, I'm handing over to Peter. Thank you, Peter. Okay, I'm going to end it now. Thank you, everybody. Shall I share the results quickly for everybody?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so there we go. So what we've got is, not surprisingly, we've got about, most of you are December and March year ends, which is fabulous. A few Junes and Septembers keen to know what's going on. Majority of you are proceeding with a bare minimum physical AGM. Okay, a couple of you are trying to do a wholly virtual AGM. That's ambitious, great, and a few hybrids. There we go. Alternative shareholder engagement, again, so actually a fair split across there, if that's helpful. And then one of the questions we asked is, are you considering holding shareholder days later in the year to offer access to the board? Got just over 50% considering, which is positive. And then I just thought I'd throw this in terms of what has been the most challenging thing for you to date. And I think understanding the legal and the technical requirements, that's great, over 50%, because that's why we're doing this session today, because I think it is very confusing. Managing internal expectations, about 30%. I can imagine it's very difficult. And then managing shareholder expectations, about 40%. And interestingly, reliability of technology, I think this has surprised all of us, hasn't it? That technology, actually, we're so much more accelerated in terms of how we're able to deal with it. And we were talking this morning, I mean, the technology for a lot of these things has been here for a long time. We just haven't been fully utilizing it. So it'll be interesting to see where we go in the future. So I'm going to stop sharing that, and then Peter, I think your way.
Okay. Thank you, Sally. So what I wanted to do fairly quickly, and I'll rattle through this presentation. I think Sally and the team are going to circulate it in due course. But what I thought would perhaps set things in a little bit of context is around what the options are for those companies who have got their AGM in these interesting times, and talk a little bit about the guidance that that Slaughter and May and ourselves and some other law firms put together and got reviewed by the Financial Reporting Council and by Bayes. The idea of going through that process and the idea of producing that guidance was to give people some sort of help and some thoughts that they can hopefully rely on a little bit as they sort of get their way through the situation. And so the options really for a company are to adapt the basis on which you hold the AGM to make it effectively lawful in the light of the changed circumstances, to delay convening the AGM if you haven't yet issued your notice, to postpone the AGM if you're permitted to do so under your Articles of Association, to adjourn it, or to conduct a hybrid AGM if that is permitted under your articles. I'll go through each one of those options in a little bit more detail. So if you're adapting the basis on which you hold your AGM, what we were originally looking at was identifying the position with your venue provider. Now, as we've moved a little bit further through the season, increasingly we're seeing companies who have already made a decision to change their venue from what they might traditionally have used, so to use their offices rather than one of the big meeting venues in London, which will be closed. You can look at arranging supplemental venues. We still think that a really good plan is to establish a dedicated area on your website where you can keep people up to date with what the latest position is as far as your AGM is concerned, and encourage proxy voting. I think there's been a split in the past between those shareholders who vote by proxy and those shareholders who attend the meeting. It's really important to encourage people to vote by proxy this year. And I think the feedback I've had so far is that the number of companies have seen a significant increase in their proxy voting levels this year as a result of that encouragement. Went on a slide too soon there. Try and work my way back. Establishing an online shareholder Q&A for the AGM is something that a lot of companies are considering. I think that's something that's changed throughout the season. When we first started off in the very earliest general meetings under the COVID-19 arrangements, what I think a number of us found was that companies were very nervous about allowing any interactivity because they were unsure of the technology. And increasingly what we've been seeing is people making that more available, whether that's live at the AGM, whether that is online in advance or online afterwards, or simply whether it's a separate event. And I think one of the other things that's been particularly welcomed by investors has been the idea of an online shareholder Q&A and also a shareholder event later in the year. Probably the biggest issue for a lot of organisations has been quorum. I think I'm speaking largely to a corporate audience today, where typically that's going to be less of an issue, because very many companies have got a quorum for their AGM of 2 shareholders present in person or by proxy. That makes it relatively straightforward. Some of the other organisations with whom I've been dealing have got rather larger quorums. I was talking on a webinar this morning. There was an organisation that has a quorum of 50 for its AGM, which obviously creates all sorts of other issues. But quorum is important. Look at how you form your quorum, and look at the people that you're going to need for that, and potentially restrict the number of non-shareholder attendees. Look at who you need to be there. You can pre-register attendees if you want to. You can live stream the AGM, and if you have got to have people attending a meeting, introduce appropriate safety measures, because of course we've got the social distancing and things like that to worry about now. Obviously, don't worry about the provision of refreshments, although I did think it was very important at the Smith Nephew AGM, where I was the shareholder, that Susan brought a cinnamon bun along, which I ate. Don't worry about the attendance of your directors either. One of the things that we very often have had feedback on is, well, surely all our directors have got to be at the AGM. There is no legal requirement for them to be there. It's simply good practice. It's normal practice. But if that's not possible because of the circumstances in which we now find ourselves, it's not, unless you've got a particularly restrictive set of articles, it's not an issue that they can't be there. If you haven't issued your meeting notice and you've got time to do so, you can delay convening the meeting. But do be aware that if you're a 31st of December year end with a requirement to hold your AGM by the 30th of June, that is not going to buy you very much time. But if you are in a position to delay your meeting, just bear in mind what those other issues might be, your authorities, your remuneration policy, and so on and so on. Sometimes you can postpone your meeting if your articles permit you to do so. Not everybody's do. I think my message to company secretaries is very often, go back to your source documents, read your articles of association. And I think this is a situation particularly where that's important to do that. Again, if you're postponing your meeting and you've got that 6-month deadline, that doesn't really help you very much. It's why in many cases we felt that the best answer was to simply press on and have your meeting regardless. If you have had to start the meeting and you then have to adjourn it, be aware of a couple of things. Be aware that it usually needs to be a quorum meeting in order to enable an adjournment. And even if you do that, the adjourned meeting must still be held within your deadline for holding your meetings. What number of questions we had about where your venue is closed. I think this was typically earlier in the season. Simply make an announcement of the adjournment. There are some law firms who have been suggesting that you should actually turn up and stand on the pavement in the middle of London, probably in a rainstorm, in order to actually carry out that adjournment. But I'd strongly suggest you seek your own advice on that one, because that really doesn't seem very sensible to me. And then you've got the option of a hybrid AGM. There are a number of law firms who have expressed doubt about the validity of purely virtual meetings, and so if you're planning to go virtual, do make sure your lawyers are happy with that. But if the articles allow it, you certainly can conduct a hybrid meeting, which is a combination of a physical and electronic meeting. And there's just a few steps that you can helpfully walk through to pick that up. Since we produced the original guidance, we've got these stay-at-home measures. It's really important that I think the message that we're looking at there is check your articles of association, coordinate with your registrars, coordinate with any venue provider, and ensure your shareholders are kept up to date. But fundamentally, there's no reason why most UK listed public companies can't hold a valid meeting while the stay-at-home measures are in force. It just needs a little bit of slightly different thinking. And I know that some companies have had 2 or 3 scripts to work through as they're getting themselves ready as, well, what are we going to have to do? I think a lot of us historically tend to rinse and repeat, tend to look at what we published last year, and then simply change the dates and the resolution details. I think it's much more difficult to do that this year because you've got different priorities and different things that you have to take part of, have to arrange around yourselves. The other question that we've had quite a lot is about shareholders attending. Can you prevent shareholders and proxies from attending a general meeting? Well, quite simply, the stay-at-home measures prohibit public gatherings of more than 2 people. So yes, you can. It is within the stay-at-home measures to travel for essential work. And if you are part of the quorum of the meeting and you're attending the meeting for business reasons, that is legal. What we've been advised is not legal is for shareholders to turn up to a meeting that they're hoping to attend. Quorum is important. And you're going to have to think about that a little bit more and a little bit differently. As I say, for those organisations where quorum requirement is 2, that's relatively straightforward. Your articles will determine who chairs the general meeting. Look at that carefully, because that will typically be the chair of the board. But there are usually sort of arrangements then if the chair of the board is not available. So you can look at that and see how that works and what is most effective for you. And finally, I've mentioned the point about directors. I've mentioned the point about what to do if your venue is unavailable. I think that probably finishes in 10 minutes, Sally, what I usually take about an hour to talk through. But I thought that just sets some context for us as we then go through the rest of the session. Just like to thank Slaughter and May and the other companies that worked with us to produce the guidance.
Peter, thank you. That was super. There's a few questions in the chat box. Maybe we'll just take 1 or 2 of them while we let Susan get ready. I've just given you the screen, Susan, so hopefully you can have that. Well, there's a question about the any update on the emergency legislation and when it's likely to come into force. I know that's been top of mind for a lot of people. Peter, do you have any more insight on that?
Only at the moment, not yet. I know that the Department for Business are working on some amendments to the Companies Act. There is work going on that, but I understand that they need to make it via primary legislation because it is amending the Companies Act, and therefore it has to wait for Parliament to reassemble, and then it has to be presented to Parliament and go through Parliament. If it's to be tied in with the other things that were announced at the same time about insolvency, that probably means that it will be less of a nod through than it might otherwise have been. So my view is that we probably won't be seeing that in the immediate future. Now, I might be wrong. They might present it this week and it might go through quite quickly, but we just don't know. And certainly, although although I've seen drafts of the documentation, I don't know that they're in any way prepared to put it through yet. So we'll have to wait and see, I'm afraid.
Okay. Okay, great. All right. So we'll take a number of questions afterwards, but what we thought is we'd let Susan do her case study because we thought through that it might answer some of your questions that you do have as well. So Susan, I'm going to pass it over to you. So
thank you. Thank you very much, Sally and Peter. So I'm Susan Swabey, Company Secretary of Smith Nephew. For those of you who don't know Smith Nephew, we're a FTSE 30 healthcare company listed in the UK and the US, with our major operations in the US and China, Europe and Asia Pac. I'm just going to talk through, we were one of the first large companies to have an AGM on the 9th of April. And I was just going to talk you through our timeline and our thought processes as we went along. Obviously, if you haven't yet had your own AGM, your thought process is going to be very different because whereas we were issuing a notice thinking we were just going to be a normal year, you're now issuing notices knowing that it's definitely not a normal year. But hopefully some of our thought processes might be of help. Now, I'm just trying to work out how to get, sorry, Sally, I'm trying to get to the next slide. Right, thank you. Yes, so we go whiz back to 18th of February. The board approved the annual report and the AGM notice and our results. And at that time, the national focus was that there'd just been a handful of cases and they were trying to contain the virus. For us at Smith Nephew, COVID-19 was primarily an issue affecting our China business. And, you know, our board discussions were all around, you know, how are we going to recover from the loss of revenue in China? There was at that time no thought that there'd be any impact on our AGM. It's been forward a few weeks when we post our annual report and AGM notice. That's the 2nd of March. At that point, there had still only been 36 cases. And again, we thought there was going to be no impact on our AGM and it would just be as normal. However, during the next few weeks, as the number of cases grew, I mean, I think our first thought was that, you know, most of our shareholders who turn up to the AGM are of a certain age, and there was sort of concern that they were the profile group that needed to be protected. You know, we then started to wonder, you know, will the venue close, and then what would we do? And so our first thought was, well, we're going to, you know, we could all, if the venue closed, we could have a core meeting on the street outside. Then we moved on to 12th of March when we took the decision in the UK to put all our office-based staff in the UK onto remote working as precautionary measures. At that point, we were still planning for a small short meeting at the venue. We thought, well, we wouldn't have speeches, we wouldn't have refreshments, and we'll try and get it over quickly and get everybody out so that they were safe. But then, of course, we got to the 23rd of March, lockdown commences, and overnight everything changes. And funnily enough, even once lockdown had been announced, we were still thinking, well, the venue's closed, we can't have gatherings of more than 2, but we can still meet on the street. And we had the ICSA guidance just before lockdown, and then we had the supplementary guidance a few days after lockdown. I'm trying to get to the next page, but I can't. Ah, yes, there we are. So by the time we got to the 30th of March, we thought, well, we obviously can't go ahead at the venue. We need to tell our shareholders. So we issued the RNS. By this time, the full impact of the lockdown was becoming clear. You know, venues were closed, prohibition on gatherings of more than 2 people. So we issued an RNS, and we also chose to write to each of our registered shareholders. Our message was, do not attend the AGM. The meeting will be organised by the company with a minimum quorum, and will be followed by an audio cast with the CEO doing a presentation, and there'll be a facility for Q's and A's. Shareholders were invited to submit questions by the proxy cut-off date. Now, we only gave the shareholders who were on the register and received a letter details of the audio cast, and we only gave them details of how to submit their questions. It was partly because we didn't want to have a whole lot of other people turning up to our audio cast and perhaps disrupting it or submitting questions you know, when they weren't shareholders. We were still planning for the formal meeting to take place on the street outside the venue, with my Deputy Secretary Vicky and one other London-based employee shareholder forming the quorum. However, as time went on, I became uneasy about exposing our fellow employees to unnecessary risk at the venue. I was partly thinking that persistent shareholders who were choosing to disobey the stay-at-home measures could quite likely want to turn up and be disruptive, and I felt that that was a potential health risk for the two employee shareholders that could be there. So we were also worried that actually police could turn up and challenge a gathering, because although the company was organising just a meeting of two, you know, shareholders could still turn up and break the stay-at-home measures. So we then also thought about whether Peter and I would hold the meeting at our home. And then I also thought about driving up to the chair's house and holding a meeting in his driveway. And so sort of in anticipation for a potential meeting in our dining room, I transferred one share to Peter, and I also transferred a share to my deputy. That transfer, of course, was announceable because I'm a PDMR, so even though it was just 2 shares, we had to make the announcement, and Peter's obviously a connected person. So that was an extra wrinkle. Spin forward another week, and by then we'd come to the conclusion that we didn't really want our home address being made public, and we didn't even want the chair's home address being made public. Another company, journalists had sort of gathered outside and taken photographs and made disparaging comments about their front garden, and I really didn't want that happening with us, and didn't want the potential disruption to neighbours. So we issued a second RNS, and that announced that the venue will be on the common at the end of our road, literally sort of 500 yards away from our house. So at that point we were then thinking, well, we hope the weather stays fine, and luckily it did. The next day, the 7th of April, that was our proxy date and our Q&A date cut off. Interestingly, as Peter mentioned earlier, we had a record number of proxies. We had 79.2% of proxies were received, which was way above any voting records in the past. However, we had very few questions from shareholders. By the proxy cut-off date, only one shareholder, and you can probably all guess who he is, had submitted about 10 or 12 questions. I was a bit disappointed we hadn't had more. Now I need to go to the next slide, Sally. I'm not really sure how to. Right, yes. So we then get to the day itself. So we had 2 meetings that day. We had the formal AGM with just Peter and myself forming the quorum. And then an hour later, we had an audio cast, which was the chairman speaking and a presentation. So the formal AGM, we met on our local common, as I say, to keep our private address confidential. I was concerned that we'd have a couple of shareholders, you know, the awkward ones, turning up and asking awkward questions and demanding their right to turn up at an AGM. So I was a bit concerned we might have to enforce social distancing. So I had my walking stick with me. We also took 10 poll cards and some pens and an envelope to cater for any people that wanted to fill in poll cards and submit votes on the day. And I was sort of, before it happened, every car that was going around, I was anxiously looking to see if they were going to stop and come and join the meeting, but nobody did. I did a formal chair's script, just as you'd ordinarily do, and it took about 3 minutes to get through. We also set up a WhatsApp group that was recording at the same time, with my deputy on the line, with registrar and a corporate lawyer, so that we had evidence that the meeting actually did take place and we weren't just saying it happened. And then my brother, who's self-isolating with us, was also there, and he took a mobile phone video, which we've got as additional evidence should it ever be challenged. I think somebody on the Q's and A's asked a question about what do you do about display documents. Obviously, even though it was very local to our house, I wasn't going to lug the usual box 500 yards. We kept all the display documents, soft copies on my laptop, which we took with us. So that if anybody wanted to see the documents, they could. Very relieved that Peter did not demand to see the display documents in the middle of the meeting, but we felt that we just needed to do it all properly, and that's how we handled that one. Then we trotted back home, and about an hour later, we had the audio cast. The chair made the introductions, handed over to the CEO, who did his usual sort of presentation about the business and particularly about the impact of COVID on the company. As I said, we had had very few questions from ordinary shareholders ahead of the meeting. About half an hour before the meeting started, we had another shareholder who you will all know who submitted another 10 questions. So we had 2 sets of questions from shareholders, but that was all we received. For the number of people dialing into the call, we had 22 people in the audio cast, which was very disappointing. 16 of them were directors and members of the COSEC team and the comms team, and the rest were your sort of traditional shareholder. So we had the questions from the 2 shareholders, which we grouped into themes. We toned down some of the language because it was fairly aggressive language, which would have been odd for the chair to read. He answered those questions, and it was all over very quickly. The 2 shareholders who had submitted questions, we corresponded with afterwards by email, answering the details. So it all went very smoothly. We chose to go the formal route with a formal AGM completely separate from the audio cast because we hadn't done a hybrid meeting before. And I was very anxious that given that we're all over the place, normally if you would be doing a hybrid meeting, you'd be in a room with all your technological support, everybody holding the hands of the directors, not literally, but helping them get through it all. I thought I didn't want anything to go wrong technologically, which would then invalidate the legality of the formal meeting. So my priority was to get the formal AGM done and dusted, and then the audio cast separate. I didn't really want to go into the dark with new technology, untried for us in this very weird situation. That was all I was going to say. Happy to take questions. Just one final slide to show how all good AGMs end with refreshments on the common. So I was sorry, I'm dressed like that, so bright orange t-shirt, so any shareholder would recognise this if need be. That's my script and the AGM notice in my hand, and a cinnamon bun in Peter's.
Excellent. I love that.
Over to you, Sally.
Fantastic. Susan, that was great. And I mean, I really insightful and answered a lot of questions. Just on reflection, I mean, it sounded like clearly a lot of thought went into every single thing to make sure that you took, which I guess is your role, to take the risk out of everything that you were doing and thought about every single eventuality. Was there anything that you didn't think about that you thought, oh gosh, or do you think you had covered everything, or is there anything that you would have done a bit differently?
I'm sure there probably was something that we didn't think about, but it didn't come to pass, so we were all right. What we had was we eventually had about 6 different scripts of the chair's script for all the different eventualities. As things evolved and got worse and worse and worse, we had to keep adapting. So we were sort of juggling a lot of balls at the same time when we were all working remotely. So that was challenging. I think we had daily calls on this with the comms team and the COSEC team, and sort of just bashing heads together to think through every single eventuality. I mean, I think the display documents, I think one of the questions earlier was, what do you do about the display documents before the meeting? And actually, that is a good point. Our display documents were still at our lawyers for inspection, and that's something I hadn't thought about what to do, and thought about it on the day. It's just to try and keep all the different possibilities open and adapting quickly. I think I was saying earlier that company secretaries, we're very, very good at planning for the whole year. We've all got our calendar, all our process notes all in line, and we know exactly what we're doing on the 15th of June, etc. But suddenly we were all having to do things really quickly and create and invent when we didn't know what the law was. The legislation still hasn't come in. We were still dependent on the guidance and our articles, and it helped. The stay-at-home measures helped a lot, actually, because that put us. That made it definite, right, we definitely can't do the meeting. The venue's going to be closed. We can't have more than 2 people. That made it much easier than before lockdown, because before lockdown, we thought we were more likely to get awkward people that were going to insist on coming and breathing over us and making us all ill.
Okay, great. Very helpful. There's a couple of questions. I'm going to go out to Robert, but just before I do, there is a question or a comment. Was this the favorite AGM in your whole career, Susan? I thought it was a rather good one.
Beating your wife question. I mean, how could I say that having an AGM with my husband wasn't my favorite AGM? I don't know. I don't know whether it was really. I think it was a shame not to have the company secretary, the shareholder engagement. I know some of the shareholders with their questions that can be persistent, can be a bit awkward, but I miss that, and I do think it's important that shareholders are able to have that one day of a year when they hold directors to account, and I think it would be a shame if that goes. So I don't think I'd say it was my favourite AGM. I'm trying to think which was now. In fact, probably the truth is none of them are. You just wait for the date to be over.
Okay. That's helpful, Susan. Thank you very much for that. And we'll pick up on some questions, but I wanted to get to Robert, because there's a couple of technical questions. One of the questions from one of the attendees is it possible to include in the notice of meeting 2 venues for the meeting on an either or basis?
Yes, I saw that with a bit of trepidation, because that's
I threw you the hard one first, Robert.
Yeah, that's a tricky opener. Look, my gut feel is probably not, because I think that your notice needs to specify the place of the meeting. So I think you're better off going for one place and then looking at how you would change that later if you need to do a switch. I think, as Susan said, I do think life has got easier since the stay-at-home measures. You know, we were all sort of flapping around a bit at the beginning of March with lots of different alternative ways of doing things. I think that the stay-at-home measures, combined with the guidance that Bayes reviewed and we put together with ICSA, actually allow you, I think, to sort of go on a basis of holding a closed meeting, if that's the way you want to go, but and adding bells and whistles if you want to add on to that. So I think there should be a route through now where you can proceed with a fair amount of certainty that your sort of plan A is more likely than not to be the plan. So I would go out with that. And then if you do want to switch the venue for any reason, I would go back to some of the things that Peter was talking about around how you do that. And particularly helpful if you've got what sort of slightly misleadingly are called postponement provisions in your articles, because those provisions tend not to just allow you to postpone the date and the time, but also to change the venue, and to do that in a relatively low maintenance way through an RNS announcement and sometimes an advert in a newspaper or 2. But that generally, I don't think has been, especially where you've got those provisions, been seen as being too burdensome. As Peter said, there's some concern if you don't have that, whether you can use the adjournment provisions. And you need to take your own legal advice on this. But I think that the risk of a court, or actually anyone challenging the use of an adjournment provision where a meeting where you said it was going to be held can no longer be held at that meeting, and using the adjournment provisions to change the location of the meeting in advance of it, I think it seems like a low risk. And we've seen a number of companies do that. There was the high profile one early in the piece in March around saying that they were adjourning to hold at a service station on the M25 in between the sort of closest possible route for the least hassle for two directors. So I think I would go down that route.
Okay, that's helpful. And why do you think more companies are not hosting closed meetings at the director's house? Is it for sort of the reasons Susan stated, or are there other reasons?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's fear of, if you put the sort of chairman's house or someone high profile, it's fear of people, going to that regardless of whether they're meeting and complaining about things. And then I think there's the Susan point around not wanting to have your garden patio criticised in the press.
And why are more companies not delaying their AGMs, especially given the increased time to publish accounts, do you think?
No, it's a good question. And actually, interestingly, the poll results were sort of as we expected, that I think most people are going for the sort of bare minimum, let's just get on with it. And I think there is a feeling that whilst this takes up a lot of our time and probably a lot of the time of people on this call, actually people are out there making, there are bigger concerns for businesses at the moment. So I think that there's very much a feeling of let's get this done. There's a feeling that, some authorities are going to expire. So delay sometimes isn't an option. I also think that you've still got the Companies Act requirement to hold your AGM within 6 months. So most people probably aren't holding. The option of delaying gives you a month or two, but not much more, which I think is, on the basis that we're likely to be living with these restrictions for some time. Most people are just cracking on. I also think that the provisions that have been introduced around the extension that the FCA has done for listed company and their accounts and the Companies House filings are somewhat of a red herring, because if you've still got to have your meeting within 6 months, unless you were to separate and take out your accounts from those meetings and maybe hold a separate accounts meeting later that's going to fill all the audience with complete dread, I think you're actually only gaining a month or two. So I think not surprising that most people are cracking on. And I think the guidance and some of the helpful commentary from Bayes, and when we do eventually get the legislation, even more helpful legislation, has shown there is a route forward to holding. So I think that, to my mind, I've been advising my clients that they should be cracking on.
Okay, helpful. Okay, there's a couple of technical questions here. So one is, can a person count as more than 2 people towards the quorum requirements? So for example, if you have a quorum requirement of 3 people, can't it be satisfied by 2 shareholders attending where one of them is also appointed as a proxy for someone else? Is that possible?
It is usually possible. I'm going to look very lawyery by saying it's all dependent on your articles, but luckily Peter said that you need to go back to your source document early. By and large, that should be possible. I think that there are 2 things to bear in mind that are separate things. One is the requirement for a meeting, and the common law says that you need to have more than 1 person to constitute a meeting. So I think you'll always need a minimum of 2 people. With regards to the quorum is usually phrased in such a way that it is 2, 3, 4, however many the quorum might be, persons voting, whether as shareholder or as proxy. And I think that allows you to have 2 people satisfy a quorum of maybe more than 2 people, because if you've got someone who is a shareholder and then holding multiple proxies, that person counts as more than 1 person.
Okay, helpful. Another question we've had is, what is the position of people listening in via a webcast?
I think that largely depends on, again, what your articles say, but also sort of how you've chosen to arrange the meeting. I mean, by and large, if you're allowing people to listen in, but you're not going down the full sort of hybrid route, then people attending by webcast are listening in, and maybe they can ask questions, but they are not in attendance such that they are able to vote. So they won't count towards the quorum.
Okay, all right, helpful. Now, I know dividend has been a big subject lately. So one of the questions is, what should I do if we propose to withdraw or modify the recommendation of a final dividend?
Right, this has taken up a lot of my time in the last sort of month and a half. So look, the easy one is where you haven't published your notice yet, but you've announced in your prelims or similar your intention to pay a dividend, and that's an easy one. You make an announcement, and you obviously don't include it in your meeting. If you've already published your notice, again, the immediate thing is that's likely to be inside information, so you make an announcement. Now, the usual position under common law is that when you want to withdraw a resolution that you propose to shareholders, you put that withdrawal to the meeting. Our view is that that's not necessary in relation to a withdrawal of a dividend. The articles will usually state that you can't approve or pay a dividend beyond that's been recommended by the directors. So I think if the directors have withdrawn their recommendation for a dividend, then there is no way that resolution can have any effect. So we're advising clients that they can just simply withdraw that.
Okay, that's a good question. Okay, another question we've got is, what happens if we're proceeding on a sort of a bare minimum basis and the situation changes? So the stay-at-home measures are removed or relaxed. What do we do about that? Is there any guidance you can give?
This is the optimist question, isn't it?
Yes,
I think that we'd all see this as very good news, except maybe the COSEC team, who might be put into a state of discombobulation. My view is that it seems unlikely that we wouldn't be given some advance notice of that. I'm not seeing too many people contingency plan and spending time contingency planning, because actually I think it's just so impractical. Once you've decided to hold the meeting at your registered office, or in Susan's case on the nearby common, to think about sort of putting together a giant venue in London or Manchester or Birmingham, wherever you're going to hold it, at short notice just isn't practical. So I think the key will be shareholder comms. As I say, my guess is that we'll be given some notice of it. Also, the famous legislation, I'm afraid I don't have much more of an update on timing than to what Peter did, but I think the legislation will be helpful. I think that if that came to pass, there'd be more pressure on the legislation to come into play quicker, because that legislation, we think, will say that for a period of time, as opposed to linking to when restrictions are, so you don't get into this sort of hokey-cokey of do I need to, don't I need to, but for a period of time, you can hold your meeting on this basis, and I think that would give people comfort. So I think my advice there is be brave and keep fingers crossed on that one, and there'll be a workaround should it come to pass.
Okay, good. Okay, a question for all of the panel then. And Susan, you mentioned a little bit about this, but what are companies doing to engage with shareholders moving forward if they're not attending the AGM, or are there plans to do that? No, in the polling, we had quite a few people that said that they would put on extraordinary kind of meetings. Susan, maybe you could start, and then we'll go to Peter and then follow up with Robert.
So at the beginning, that's what we thought we would do, is that we would just have the formal AGM with just 2 people, and that we would put on an event sort of October, November time, when hopefully things would be back to quotes normal, perhaps a visit to our offices and a tour or something, with an opportunity to ask directors questions. And then it became clear that really, I think investors are wanting to have questions answered as at the time of the normal AGM, if at all possible. So we went down that route. I was still in the back of my mind thinking, well, it would be nice to have a proper event for shareholders later on in the year. However, it depends how the lockdown restrictions are lifted. They could be lifted, but we still have to observe very strict social distancing at any venue we might want to go to for a number of months. So that's going to be difficult to do. And also, I come back to the age profile of our shareholders that are likely to attend. They still need to be protected, and we shouldn't be encouraging them to come out to things. And then I think, well, should we do an electronic thing? But if we had a very disappointing turnout for what we did offer. Maybe that's partly to do with the age profile as well. At the moment, I'm not planning anything different, but I do think if you don't do some sort of audio cast or interaction or something at the time of AGM, maybe you should be thinking about it later in the year. So you've got something.
Super. And Peter, in your experience, have you seen or talked to people planning on doing other things?
I agree with what my wife said.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, yes, we have a little bit. I mean, there's, I think generally when companies were looking at finding themselves in this situation, one of the things that a lot of them were very keen to do was to ensure that they were, as far as possible, engaging with their investors. I know there were a number of calls into some of the bigger investors saying, what do you think about this? That was one of the reasons why we asked the Investment Association to get involved when we were producing the guidance, because we thought it was important that it was shown that they were behind it as well. I think the idea of having conference calls with shareholders, of webcasting, of arranging a future shareholder event later in the year when everything's calmed down a little bit. I think those are all really good ways of tackling it. I think the other thing, and Susan alluded to it a little bit, is that the constituency of investors who turn up at the AGM is quite a different one from some of the other constituencies with whom companies may sometimes engage. You're looking at some of the retail investors, and we all joke about the regular attendees. We all joke about their specific questions, but you do sometimes have retail shareholders who've got what is for them quite a large shareholding in the company, who do turn up to the AGM, do take it seriously, and do ask sometimes some very good questions. And I think that's important. I think it's important that level of engagement carries on. I've been struck by groups like Share Action, for example, who have posted online. This is what we would have asked at the so-and-so AGM had we been able to do so. Some companies then engaging with that and saying, and if you had been able to do so, this is what we would have answered, which I think is a great way of dealing with those sort of queries. So yeah, I think it is important to demonstrate to your investors that you are trying to engage with them still. Certainly, I've had some feedback from some of the institutional groups that they are looking quite carefully at how companies are dealing with this situation. Not just the management of the AGM, issues around the dividend, which Rob was talking about earlier. And I should, by the way, give a plug to a guidance note that's recently been published by a certain well-known professional body with the help of Slaughter and May, for which we're very grateful, which talks about the issues about if you've got to withdraw or amend your dividend resolution in some detail. But about executive pay, a lot of institutional investors are saying, well, hang on a minute, you're perhaps putting people out on furlough. How are you reflecting shareholder and employee experience in the executive pay experience? What should you be doing there? So yeah, I think there are a lot of things to be said for thinking about all these issues very, very carefully indeed.
Okay, that's helpful. And just do you think then this will signal a move towards virtual only meetings in the future as more companies become successful at holding them in these ways? It kind of is aligned with your train of thought about engaging with shareholders. Do you think we'll move to that environment? Robert, maybe I'll start with you this time and then.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting on the poll results, because I think that there are actually very few companies that I've seen that are doing things. I think that aren't registered in the UK that can do that. I saw Old Mutual, that's a South African company, obviously with the listing here, that they're going down that route. But I think that amongst practitioners, there are concerns around the validity of holding a virtual only meeting because of the requirement in the Companies Act to have a place, which commentators have taken to be a physical place. Now, I think that if the legislation comes in, that may well be something that gets dealt with in the legislation for the temporary period to allow virtual only meetings. Whether long term this is something the government looks at and then companies subsequently look at to put in their articles, I would think probably not. I think that the investor community have been quite vocal in that they have never been supportive of virtual only meetings. They're perfectly supportive of hybrid meetings. And I think when the world returns to normal, I don't expect that to change. I think, especially given people have mentioned some of the age profile of the typical attendees at general meetings, I think they may feel a bit disenfranchised by virtual only meetings. So the short answer is no, I don't think they'll become the norm. I think there's been a question for a number of years now about whether hybrid meetings will become more common to allow more participation. And I think this could accelerate towards that, in particular if the ones that are doing it, which I think are still actually a surprisingly small amount of number, even when companies have the provisions in their articles, if they can demonstrate successfully that they've done that, then maybe we'll see that.
Okay, helpful. Did you want to add anything, Peter or Susan, or I've got one final question about company secretaries?
I'll just throw in very quickly on that and say that I agree with what Rob said. I'm doing well on this. I agree with people. I agree with what
Very
Rob
boring
said.
panel. Yeah.
We're not married. I agree with what Rob said, that you know, I think it will perhaps mean a move towards hybrid meetings. I think one of the concerns that I've certainly heard from a number of organisations is concern about the potential cost of going down the hybrid meeting route. And I think there are arguments on both sides for that, but it's one for each individual organisation to look at. But no, I think one of the features that I'm seeing with a lot of the things that seem to be happening on COVID-19, we talked about webinars earlier on, is that we are seeing people having to deal with issues in a different way. And I think perhaps this is going to be one of the things that does carry on. But as Rob said, I think it will tend to be hybrid rather than virtual.
Okay, that's helpful. And Susan, maybe I'll end with you with just a final question, because this is just Peter sort of teed it up. And I think it would be great to just give your views on how you see this whole crisis and the evolving role of the company secretary, and perhaps the opportunity that comes out of it for you as individuals within your businesses.
Yeah, I think the whole thing has been enormously helpful at raising the profile of company secretaries. I mean, as I said, we had to have 6 different scripts, multiple different scenarios to present to the board, and then, you know, problem solving on the hoof in a very, very short space of time where there was no precedent to follow. We were in contact with a couple of other companies that were also holding their AGMs that same week, but you know, I think the company secretary team was seen as innovative, which is probably an unusual description for a company secretarial team normally. Practical, you know, it wasn't just you know, the hiding behind the legals. It was coming up with practical circumstances, and, you know, to be frank, the walking stick and the cinnamon bun was a bit of humour in which lifted the sort of environment in the board meeting. And I think so that's good as well. But I think the whole scenario, we've all had to sort of set up board meetings where directors are having to use you know, Zoom, Teams, whatever. One of my directors had to learn 6 different platforms because he was on different boards and different organisations, and some organisations use 2 or 3 different platforms. And in 1 week, they had to be transformed into techie people when, you know, typically that they weren't. And so a lot of the COSEC work that first couple of weeks was really holding their hands remotely and getting them through it, and bearing in mind that directors, you know, we were talking about the mental health of employees and people throughout the whole of this, but, you know, directors are impacted by all of that as well. And I think this is a time that company secretaries can be close to their directors, you know, and help their emotional needs as well. This doesn't often happen, I think, and perhaps it is an opportunity. I think the whole thing, we just have to, in order to get through it, we all have to look at the long-term opportunities, you know, that will be at the end of it when we've come through the other side. And I think there are some for company secretaries.
Yeah, super. And I think that's a lovely note to end on. Lots of encouragement there and lots of opportunities. So what's the saying? Never waste a good crisis. Let's see how we can innovate and become more creative out of it. So I just wanted to thank everybody for attending, fantastic, and participating, and particular massive thanks to Robert, Peter, and Susan for taking the time today. We'll be circulating, as I said, the webinar and the slides from today if you want, and a little summary of the event and the Q&A. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a great holiday weekend.